afternoon. As you know, the purpose of government is to protect the life, liberty, and property of its citizens. But what happens when criminals and terrorists leave electronic footprints instead of real footprints? What does the government do then? And how does it protect our privacy while simultaneously protecting our life and our liberty? To discuss that, we have Governor Gilmore and also Charlie Kirk. Okay, I had like a perfect opening and I just completely fudged it. There you go. Well, in order to discuss these issues, I've got these two fine gentlemen. What I'm going to have them do is give each a 10-minute opener. Then I'll ask a series of questions. They will have 2 minutes apiece to answer those questions with a 1-minute rebuttal. And then will be a chance for you to give some questions to them, and then they will have a chance to close. With that, I give you Governor James Gilmore.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much. I've seen a lot of you already, and thank you. Charlie and I did something like this at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, several months ago, and it was so flamboyant they decided to invite us back. So we'll see if we can't not disappoint. Now, I don't know what biography was given because I was sequestered at the back. I might as well be a congressman, I guess, but so I'm not sure what that is. But you probably at this point know that I was an elected prosecutor, the Commonwealth's attorney in my local county, so I've been a courtroom prosecutor as well as a defense counsel. I was the Attorney General and Governor and then Chairman of the Republican National Committee. So everybody here now knows I was a lawyer, a politician, and a party leader. It's not a good start, but my other habits are good. So let me talk about that just a little bit. I was chairman of the Board of Visitors of the United States Air Force Academy, which has put me into Colorado quite a bit. I've enjoyed this wonderful state. I'm on the board of directors of the National Rifle Association right now. That usually gets an applause line. I was an intelligence agent in West Germany in the 70s as an Army veteran during the Cold War. And I was the chairman of the advisory panel on Homeland Security for the United States at the request of the Congress for 5 years, from 1997 to 2002. And that was over the time of the 9/11 attack, and I was governor of Virginia during the 9/11 attack. The 9/11 attack is a watershed. We all know that, but it was a very serious issue. But I want to start this discussion, and I'll try to, Charlie, keep as close as I can to my 10 minutes. But this is a very complex subject. During the 9/11 attack, I was very concerned about the reaction to the 9/11 attack in the United States. The Bush administration, the Congress of the United States, and the people of the United States were all calling out for security and for demand for security. And frankly, I was pretty nervous about it, to be honest with you, at that time, and I was trying to give a bit of a counterpose. If you would ever look at the letter that I wrote to the Congress that year, I basically said that one of the principal things we needed to do was to protect democracy and individual liberties. It's paramount to achieving the ultimate victory. And the protection of our individual liberties was the entire game. Well, I don't feel any differently about that today, but I will tell you that my concerns are even greater today as far as the safety of this country goes than they were then. It's a very serious issue. The threat is much more serious now than it was at the time of the 9/11 attack in 2001. You can't go into your hotel room and turn on the television, can you? Without looking at what's going on with the James Foley beheading, with ISIS going on right now. The threat is now much more dangerous than the Cold War, because now you have both state threats and you have non-state threats. Now we have a dual problem that we have to confront as the United States of America. What are the state threats? Iran wants to have a nuclear bomb and seem determined to get it. And I, for one, do not want to see the United States at war with Iran. But what are our choices if they insist on getting a nuclear bomb? Are we going to let Iran have a nuclear bomb and then end up with Egypt getting one and Saudi Arabia getting one? And then all these nukes, not to mention Israel, all sitting there in the middle of this volatile area. The Chinese are restive. They want to change the status quo. They consider the South China Sea now a core interest. The Russians, we're all very familiar with that. my old friend, the Russians, as they now are marshaling 18,000 crack troops on the Ukrainian border this instant. What happens if they decide that they can invade the Ukraine and take it over in order to protect Russians and decide a year from now that the Baltics might want to be their next victim, members of NATO? And there are others. But that's not the principal problem. Well, it is one of the two principal problems we're facing. The other is the non-state actors that are against us. We see this most famously in Al-Qaeda and now against the rise of ISIS. And don't forget the criminal drug cartels on the southern border. These are people that belong to no nation. They observe no rules, except that they have certain asymmetrical rules of their own. They can attack this country and spend almost nothing and cause us to spend trillions of dollars in response. Have we not been doing that? How long can that go on before the democracy of the United States collapses? What about the fact that they attack, their primary mission is to attack civilians? Why do they do that? Because they want to undermine the people of the United States' confidence in their own country and in their own government. What little confidence the people of the United States have, the enemy seeks to dissipate even further so that we will turn to other forms, or at worst, isolationism, which, by the way, we have people in our own Republican Party who advocate this kind of drawback and pullback right now. At the center of the potential attack against this country is clandestine operations. The danger and attack that can happen in this country from secret cells and people in this country who might come to this country or even attack our allies. We have seen it in this nation. We saw it in a first trade center attack, then another trade center attack. We have seen it in our allies' countries, and the goal here is to attack civilians and to undermine our confidence in the ability of our state to protect our citizens. When I've developed 10 points that I believe are our strategy, I'm not going over them, you may be relieved, but I may in the morning. I'm going to speak at the breakfast in the morning for a few minutes, and I want to go over those. But one of those points I will tell you is that we must, as a nation, build upon our advantages. And one of our advantages is the high technological and scientific advantage that we have, particularly with the NSA, the National Security Agency. Now, it's enormous power, and I think Charlie's going to address some of that, and we're going to do a little more of that on Q&A as well. But I want to tell you that the loss of our technological advantage to be able to understand what the enemy is doing, where they are, what they are thinking, and what their plans are, the loss of that would be catastrophic to this country and to the safety of this country. And that is the danger that we face. And I think that the arguments that are being made that say that the NSA has to be drawn back in the name of privacy presents us, in my view, with a false choice. Our goal in this country is not to be driven to the choice of freedom or security. Our job as Americans and the challenge of leadership of this country is to achieve both, not false choices. And that is not easy to do. The simple approach is either to go all security and spy on everybody or simply to have total liberty. That is a false choice, and I say that we don't do that. I think there are ways that we can reform our plans and our NSA type of operations in order to protect the privacy of the American people and at the same time maintain our advantage because, ladies and gentlemen, I close with this comment. We are at war, a long, long war. Make no mistake about it. And I say to you that we need presidential leadership right now that understands the dangers that we face, the challenges that we have, how to thwart these false challenges, and the ability to save our country in the long war ahead. We need that kind of presidential leadership, which means we need a change in the White House. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor. Charlie Kirk.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here in Steamboat. I get to travel to Colorado every so often to the Denver area and visit some of our campus and college groups throughout the greater Denver area, but it's nice to come out to Steamboat and hike a little bit and meet all these wonderful people. I want to congratulate everyone here today. By attending this conference, you've earned yourself an IRS audit, so congratulations. You can be expecting that early next year. The governor and I had a wonderful discussion back in Washington, D.C., and I look forward to continuing that dialogue and diving into the NSA. And I'm not going to pretend to know everything and every intricacy of that monolith of the agency, and nor do people even working in it know all about it. And it's so complex, and there's so many unknowns that we have to go in understanding that this agency, we have to take a step back and talk more about the philosophical beliefs behind it and have a discussion about that. I'm going to ask everyone a question here, and I think you're going to maybe reconsider some of the thoughts of the NSA. Imagine Lois Lerner running the NSA. I want you to imagine that for a second. I bring that up intentionally. We're living in a climate and a culture with an administration and a government that uses agencies like the IRS weaponized against citizens like you. We are living, that's right, and it's true. And I wish I could clap, but I've been targeted by the IRS, and I'm sure many of you have as well. We are living in a culture and a climate where no matter what agency it is, there's evidence of collusion, of interagency conspiracy against citizens. Look at Catherine Engelbrecht from True the Vote. Was a citizen from Houston, Texas, started a nonprofit agency for election integrity, was visited by 5 different federal agencies in 2 months, audited by 3 of them, taxed by all 5. And they said, oh, we're not talking to each other. Really, when the ATF and the EPA and the IRS and all these agencies visit you and ask these questions, you're trying to tell me they're not colluding? Now, why do I bring this up? Well, we're talking about the NSA, which is admittedly probably the most powerful and most intrusive arm of the Department of Defense, which really, until Edward Snowden's actions, has gone relatively unchecked. Most Americans didn't even know what NSA meant before Edward Snowden did what he did. Trillions of lines of data have been accumulated and stored in banks in Utah, in data banks, about every person in this room. And I would like to venture a guess that with this administration, what we have seen, the track record of the abuse of power, we all know what's going on there. Do you really want to wield that kind of unchecked power to bureaucrats like Lois Lerner or that IRS guy that got in a debate with Paul Ryan? When Paul Ryan asked him, sir, why didn't you tell us that you deleted the emails? He said, well, you never asked me. Are those the people that you want running federal agencies that are able to collect trillions of lines of data? One other thing I want to mention, and the governor said the enemy, and he's exactly right. The enemy is ISIS, and the enemy is international, global, Islamic jihad, and I will agree with him on that. However, government bureaucrats don't view those as the only enemy. They view the enemy as people that disagree with what they believe in. We can see what happened in the IRS, where they thought conservatives were the enemy, that Tea Party groups were the enemy, that Republicans were the enemy. So I think we have to hesitate and say, hold on a second, if we're going to use that word so loosely, what does the word enemy mean to an unchecked NSA employee who can tap without warrant every person in this room, every phone call, every email, every text message, unchecked without warrant? Do we want to give that kind of authority to people that we know have a subversive agenda to overthrow our founding principles? There was a slideshow that's been playing throughout this conference, and there's a wonderful quote by Benjamin Franklin. He said, those who sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither. And I truly believe that. And if we're trying to get back to our founding roots and our founding principles, I think we have to, in many different instances, ask ourselves as conservatives, should we give all this authority to an agency that before Edward Snowden released it, most of us did not even know existed? Now, of course, Governor Gilmore did, because he dealt in a lot of these deeper, more complex issues. One last thing. If you look at the mission statement of the Steamboat Institute and you look at the Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute, there's 2 words that are thrown around a lot, and that's usually freedom and liberty. And also another phrase, limited government. And I'm going to say this. The left, they have no qualms with growing government. They have no qualms about growing bureaucracies. Were they out there complaining when conservatives were weaponized and targeted by the IRS? No. We have to, as conservatives, lead the charge against the abuse of power. And we have to be the vocal opponents to unchecked federal bureaucrats allowed for the warrantless and illegal and constitutional violating wiretapping of American citizens. And we as conservatives have to be those vocal opponents. And myself, at 20 years old, considering how much I tweet and how much I Facebook post and all those text messages, Boy, I'll tell you what, if Barack Obama wanted to find an enemy and look at the NSA, you just have to look at me right here. My finishing note is this. The NSA is probably the most powerful agency we've ever seen. And I'm not going to pretend to know every single intricacy, neither is the governor. But we have to ask ourselves one final question. Do you trust the federal government, and do you trust the people running it? Thank you.
Now, Charlie, I have always loved that quote about people who are willing to exchange security for liberty. But I also agree with the governor that it's a bit of a false line. It's not a question of liberty or security, it's where we put that line. Is there a country out there that's doing it right, that has that balance correct? How would you propose that we balance those two things?
Well, I have actually used that same Benjamin Franklin line at CPAC once before, as a matter of fact, in a debate. And, I knew Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was a friend of mine. He's no James Madison, but no, actually he probably was. But the point is that I thought about this question quite a bit before we got here. I don't think that it's really useful for us to examine other countries out there, because another one of our principles we need to remember is that America is exceptional. We are. There are people today that say we're not. There are people who say we're not exceptional. We are exceptional because of exactly the conference that we had this morning with Lynn Cheney when she talked about these historical founding fathers. These are the touchstones that we Americans have that no other country in the world does have. Therefore, we draw the line differently, and the challenge for us is that much greater. We are much more careful about what kind of liberties we give up than other people in other countries. So I think the duty is not to worry about what other countries do, but to worry about what we do. And it seems to me that we have to remember what the NSA is able to do because of its information technology. It's all been in the newspapers. They, at this point, know how to intercept al-Qaeda's movements, their messages. They have already succeeded in intercepting the messages of Hezbollah. It's been in the paper. They already succeeded in following an al-Qaeda leader through Africa and then getting him to the point where he could be arrested. They've already succeeded in listening in on President Karzai of Afghanistan when he was interacting privately with the representatives from Iran and told them when the departure of the Americans came that he would be working very well and making sure that there would be no interest against Iran. These are useful things for we to know as we do make policy. These are technological advantages we Americans have, nobody else in the world has. The enemy would like us to become paranoid. The enemy would like us to become distrustful. The enemy would like us to throw this advantage away so that they can get on a level playing field with us. We have advantages that have been built because of the superior state and the superior economy, the superior system that we have that have enabled us to become more sophisticated and therefore able to defend our people better. Now, I yield to no one on the basis of saying that we have to protect privacy, and I believe it can be done. And I'll point out several things here. We have had failings of NSA oversight. The Congress has miserably failed to oversee the NSA. There are congressmen today who are saying, we're looking forward to the day when their authorities expire and time is on our side, and to which I hear al-Qaeda and ISIS and Russia and China standing up as one and saying, bravo, we're on your side, Congress, because we want to bring your country down. And it's a duty of us and people like us here at Steamboat to make sure that that doesn't happen. The FISA courts, who's overseeing them? And they don't seem to be doing a very good job, or at least they have lost the confidence of the people of the United States. So we need to find ways to make sure they are properly overseen and that we know exactly what they're doing. The criminal law. Anyone who goes in, as Charlie suggests, and use this information to spy upon American citizens inappropriately and to let that information out in any improper way and to look at our pictures or our private letters and then make that available should be subject to the most stringent criminal penalties. And we need to put people in prison that do that type of thing and let people know that we will actually do it. And finally, the executive branch. The president has been woefully inadequate in the oversight of the NSA. And therefore, it creates the opportunity for us all to have a debate like this and to be suspicious of our own government, inconfident in our own ability to govern ourselves. And I say that that can't last. We have to regain our confidence in ourselves, but we do that through the election process.
Thank you, Governor. Charlie.
Yeah, I agree in a large part of that, and especially where you said we aren't other countries. You know, you look at Germany and France, they don't have a constitution with a Fourth Amendment that protects, privacy and liberty the way that we do. They don't have a provision that, disallows from unreasonable search and seizure. So I think that, we're not other countries. We are exceptional, and because of that, we should focus on our own paradigm. I will say this, that the conversation that I think we should talk about is not as much, spying on, Hamid Karzai or international, but should we be spying on American citizens? Because I think that the premise of the debate is, does it matter that the government stores every email and text and phone that we send? Now, some people in government might call us terrorists, but I wouldn't call anyone here terrorists. But does it matter that everyone in this room, does it matter that the NSA listens to us? And I would say absolutely. And it goes warrantless, it goes unchecked, and I think that I agree with you that Congress has not done a good job of overseeing this agency. I would venture a guess that before what Edward Snowden did, a majority of representatives didn't even know what the NSA was. And that was because it was just kind of this undercurrent agency that just operated, and they said, oh, they're the agency that keeps us safe. But I think it's very important that we open this dialogue and that we have to hold our elected officials accountable and ask them, do you think it's okay for the NSA to go completely unchecked, unwarranted wiretaps? And we need to start that dialogue and conversation, because if we're going to respect the Constitution and be the movement and party of liberty and limited government, then we have to go back to our roots in the Fourth Amendment. And there's really no way to say that what the NSA has done has been purely constitutional.
Can I add something to
Sure.
that? If I could just add something to that for a moment. This is the reality of what we're looking at right now. The NSA has enormous capacity through its very sophisticated computers to be able to get information. What they're getting, not to mention all the overseas information, but they are getting information that says who's calling who. They don't have the ability to look into those phone calls, not without a warrant. They can't actually look at your information. But if someone from, let's say, Yemen telephones into Chicago, they have the ability to know that. And then at that point, they are, in fact, looking around at who the other people are that that particular phone number might be talking to. And then they, at that point, can gather their evidence and say, this is interesting enough to go to the FISA court and seek a warrant. I think what we have to guard against, first of all, the Fourth Amendment is not just blanket. There are a lot of things that you do that aren't subject to the Fourth Amendment. But looking at your private conversations and looking at your information in your cell phones and so on like that, that should be protected by the Fourth Amendment. We agree about that. I'm certainly not interested in the government spying on everything that our citizens do. But the reality is that we have a technological advantage over the opposition, and the enemy would love us to throw it away because we're frankly suspicious and paranoid.
So one last thing. There has been a lot of debate, though, whether or not these people do store these things for a long term between U.S. citizens. Edward Snowden made a claim that they did. Other people said that he was mistaken, which is why I have, along with many others, called for a complete forensic congressional examination of how far have they gone with U.S. citizens. And I think we have to do that. And I think you would agree, Governor Gilmore, that it's absolutely necessary for members of both parties to call for the heads of the NSA and do a complete forensic examination of how you treat U.S. citizens. Is this being stored? And if it's being stored, who has access to it and why? So I would agree with that, but I think we need to get all the facts about that, because Edward Snowden did say that every phone call has been stored between U.S. citizens, but there's been a big debate about that amongst the intelligence community. So.
A follow-up question with that. We know from the case of James Foley that he may have been murdered by a radicalized member of the UK, a British citizen. They're still trying to figure that out. That it isn't always a case of bad guys overseas, but for all we know, we may have bad guys here, radicalized elements within our own population. We have no way of knowing. How do we track those individuals without tracking the rest of us?
How do we track those individuals without tracking the rest of us? It seems to me that you have to have a standard that says that we're going to focus in on people that we have some reason to believe, some reasonable suspicion may be a person that is involved in this kind of conduct. The enemy may, Al-Qaeda, the ISIS people may, it would be a big advantage if they could put somebody in this country that could do some type of attack. Now, it's not unheard of, is it? Take the Boston attack, for example. That they were not necessarily representatives of anybody, but they were the same ilk. But what I want to respond to is the significance of it is very material. If you could just get one guy in here with a bomb, a suitcase bomb, or worse yet, with the rising of nuclear proliferation, if you could get a really serious bomb into this country, you could change the way Americans think about themselves, and then at that point the security state could indeed arise. We have to protect ourselves against that, while at the same time protecting our privacies as well. This is the challenge of this non-state asymmetric type of warfare that we're facing here today. They want to attack citizens. They want to change the way Americans think about themselves. They want to change the way Americans think about our liberties. These are the kinds of attacks that I think we have to guard against.
Well, and I agree. Now every time someone makes a phone call, I can't tell you how many times people said, I'd rather not talk about that on the phone, let's talk in person. I mean, are the terrorists, that upset that we've spent trillions of dollars on surveillance programs? I mean, you have to understand that a lot of people do live in paranoia now from their own government, because government has grown. So we have to find that balance, and we have to say, are we going to just continue to grow government? I'm not saying that's what you're proposing, but I'm saying that the terrorists, they want us to live in fear and paranoia, and a lot of people in this room live in fear of their government, or the fear of retribution for your government, and there's more than one reason for that, and it's not necessarily because of terrorist action, but if you look at the NSA, and if we allow it to continue to go the way it has, I can tell you for one thing, it has created a lot of paranoia amongst people in all communities across America.
But as a matter of fact, you're not going to hear someone among the college Republicans someplace saying, well, we spend too much money on surveillance and so on. You're not going to hear that unless they're talking to somebody in Al-Qaeda. Then you're going to hear it.
Yeah.
But that's the challenge that we need to understand about what's really going on in NSA. We paint with too broad a brush. We run the risk of taking away one of the principal points that I believe we have to focus on, which is the enemy has big advantages. They have big advantages. They can get into this country. They can spend a few dollars, and all of a sudden all the press is talking all the time about the attack. And that's a big advantage that they've got, because they're taking advantage of a free society. They can hijack an airplane and drive it into the World Trade Center. Cost them very little. The billions upon billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars that we've spent since the 9/11 attack, which could have been used for the benefit of cutting taxes or adding to the quality of life of the American people. The enemy has great advantages. We have to make sure that we use ours too, and we have great advantages. The biggest advantage we have is this point of American exceptionalism. I have supreme confidence in the quality and nature of the American character. That's what we were discussing this morning, the American character. And that's why when this conflict that is here and that is still coming, we're going to prevail because of the nature of America.
I know that many of you are coming up with questions as we sit here. If you could write them down on these notes, on a note card that has been passed out, and someone will be by to pick that up, and I'll be bringing it up to the stage momentarily. But I'd like to ask one more question, and that is, Edward Snowden, patriot, traitor, or neither? Actually, I should let you
I'll
go first.
So we actually had this discussion at CPAC.
We did.
Personally, I think he should be held in front of a jury of his peers. I'm not going to, by no means, call him a patriot. The government has yet to charge him with treason, if I'm not mistaken. But what I will say is this: what he revealed has opened a lot of people to understand how complex the data accumulation and overreach of government has been. And I think it's indisputable that through his actions, no matter how controversial that they were, that they've really opened a dialogue and discussion about this agency that for so long was unknown. And I think that if he wanted to be truly civil disobedient, like Henry David Thoreau or Martin Luther King was, he would have turned himself in and then would have paid the price for his own crimes, not have been a vigilante internationally and then colluded with some of our enemies of the state. I don't think by any means that helped his cause. So I would totally disagree with him in that manner, but I will say that we should all understand and, in a term, pay tribute to what he did in essence by saying we now have a discussion and have a point of evidence about the NSA, because if it wasn't for him, I can guarantee you that this panel today really would not be here, because American privacy, if you look at in national circles and national debate topics, it's gone up tremendously ever since his actions in May of 2013. So.
Well, he can tell it to the jury. This is Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden is a traitor to the United States of America. Now I say to you now that Edward Snowden is a traitor. Edward Snowden was given the most confidential trust of the people of the United States. He was granted a security clearance so that he could have the availability to get the information. He betrayed that security clearance. He had a job in which he had trust from his superiors. He betrayed that trust. When the time came for him to light out and take his information to make available and undermine the security of the United States, he told his boss he was going back to California for some kind of medical treatment, got on a plane and went to Hong Kong, where, of course, as we know, is under the communist jurisdiction at this point, and then, of course, ultimately ended up in Russia, where he has received now an extended period of time of good treatment and asylum in Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that sooner or later, that the Russians are going to come to their senses and realize they're not going to be able to put the Soviet Union back together again, that being a part of the Western community of nations is to the benefit of the Russian people, and they're going to want to return to the concord of Western nations. I believe that. And when they do, one condition that the United States should place is the return of Edward Snowden for trial as a traitor to this country.
Well said. Well, I have to admit, my absolute favorite question is, can the NSA find Lois Lerner's emails or phone calls? Pretty awesome. So this is an interesting question. If I telephone someone who calls from Yemen, am I guilty of association, albeit unknowingly? And that goes to the fact that a lot of people are innocently calling countries where there are, terrorists active, but you may just be calling, calling a relative. Again, how do we separate the bad actors from the good actors and not intentionally go after people who, are seemingly guilty by association?
Well, I think that's a great question. It assumes that you're going to be targeted just as soon as you get a call from overseas. Then there's no evidence that that's the case. Furthermore, we ought to make it not the case. Seems to me that we ought to have protocols for the NSA. They ought to be in a position where they're telling people, even if it's confidentially, what they are doing, and make sure that there are people who are responsible with oversight. I said a few minutes ago, I think the Congress has been woefully inadequate in their oversight of what people are doing. But if you get a call from someone in Yemen, if there's no other evidence that the person is somehow connected to some conspiracy against the United States, why would the NSA even look at something like that? But if you do, if you're in contact with someone, frankly, your next door neighbor or your girlfriend very well may be looked at in order to determine whether or not there's some kind of a cell that's being formed that could put the people of the United States in some kind of danger.
I agree with a large part of that, but I will say, with Congress's inaction, I think it's been intentional because no one ever wanted to undo that house of cards, and no one wanted to dive deep into this agency that really would have made them a lot of enemies. So to go back to Edward Snowden, he did something rather flagrant that has now given an opportunity for Congress people to kind of have a political shield and talk about this and go to oversight without seeing any kind of political retribution. Thomas Jefferson said that when the government fears the people, there is liberty, and when the people fear the government, there is tyranny. And I want to reinforce that because if we hear fear every time we make a phone call or we get a phone call from Yemen, that's pretty close to tyranny. And I don't want to live in that kind of country, and I want to live in that kind of society. And that's where I make my point.
But it's not fair to quote Thomas Jefferson against a Virginian. It's not fair. It's just not fair to do that. It's not fair to do that. But I think that we need to recognize that what Snowden has done. This was a low-level guy. We don't know the whole story of Edward Snowden. Hopefully we'll put him on trial and we'll find some more things out about Edward Snowden. But the fact is that what he has exposed is the superiority of our knowledge. The enemy now knows that if they're sloppy in their use of cell phones, or if they use cell phones a particular way, they will be tracked. They know that, so they will now change their conduct. They know that if they do certain things that give them email information, they know that if they do that, that they're capable of being tracked. People in other countries know that if they operate in particular ways against the interests of the United States, that we will find out. And therefore, the people who are adversaries to this country, and believe me, we're in a war now, they are changing their conduct right now because of Edward Snowden. Now, if they could get us, citizens of the United States, to be so suspicious of our own country, of our own government, that we dismantle our advantages, then at that point, that is a giant strategic victory for the enemy of this country. And I promise you, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say this again. If you don't believe me, go turn on your television in your room right now and you will see. We are at war, and the worst is coming. And we have to be as prepared as we can be. We have to be as active as we can be to protect the people of this country, because the challenges, believe me, are not behind us. They are still ahead.
Charlie Kirk, would you discontinue monitoring of all electronic correspondence? If not, what parameters would you place on monitoring, or what would you replace the system with?
Sure, that's a great question. First, we have to find out exactly to the extent of what they've been doing. But I will say this. If it's to the frequency of every single text or call or email that you make, that is a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment. We all know that if the police think there's a crime happening behind the door, they can kick down the door. If there's not reasonable cause, they should not be monitoring everyday United States Americans, citizens. It's just that simple. So I think there has to be reasonable cause. If they have to get a warrant, so be it. And these FISA courts have gone completely underneath and totally unchecked. But no, I would not immediately, cease all this. I'm not saying abolish the NSA. And I've had this discussion with some people, and they say, "Oh, Charlie, you're a terrorist sympathizer," and all this crazy stuff. I say, no. I say, I'm just interjecting into the discussion that right now we live in a culture and environment with a government that abuses its power unilaterally every single day. And we have to be very careful the way we approach unchecked federal agencies and bureaucracies. So when I talk about, if somebody labels me and they say, "Oh, do you want to end all, cellular data accumulation?" I say, no, we have to reform it and we have to oversee it correctly, because I do agree with you. There are international threats that are present today that were not there 3 or 4 years ago, and there's many different reasons for that. But I will say that if we do not have a congressional oversight of this agency, we're going to continue to see the quick erosion of our civil liberties.
Thank you.
Last question.
Can I go to another question? Sure. I've got a question specifically for you from the audience. These are great questions, by the way. Thank you. Governor Gilmore, corrupt politicians throughout history have justified the removal of citizen liberty by using fear tactics. Can you provide a moral justification for Fourth Amendment violations that does not rely on fear?
A moral justification? No, I don't. I believe in the Fourth Amendment. I've been a prosecutor and a trial lawyer, and I've tried cases I've defended under the Fourth Amendment. I've gotten warrants under the Fourth Amendment, and I've been restrained by the Fourth Amendment as a potential prosecutor and attorney general. So I understand that. I don't believe there's any excuse for building up fear in the body politic in order to try to undo any part of the Bill of Rights or any of our civil freedoms. We agree with that. Nor do I believe that we pretend that things are worse than they are. I've seen Senator Paul hold up his cell phone and say the government has no right to know what you're saying on your cell phone. He's right, but he's also exploiting and building up the suspicion, this paranoia for his own presidential aspirations, which is why I do not support him and will never support him. And the fact is that we can do these things in a restrained and a reasonable way, and we can avoid the false choice of saying, well, if you have a cell phone, then obviously you're against the NSA having the capacity to do the things to protect this country. And I say baloney. I say nonsense. We can do what is necessary to use the advantages that we have built up from a free society to protect a free society. And we don't have to throw these things away because of unscrupulous politicians, particularly the ones after 9/11. That was a horrible thing. And this is what worries me. I'll sound one more trumpet call. After 9/11, the Congress, they ran like scalded apes. They were so scared. They were so afraid that they had been so delinquent and negligent as to allow this 9/11 attack that they raced immediately to do things that may have been reckless. I worry that we have not had a sufficient conversation. This panel here at Steamboat is a good panel, and Charlie's a great advocate in this area. We need to have more of a conversation with the American people to prepare them for the challenges of homeland security and for the adversaries that are determined to bring down this nation. We ought to be having that conversation, because if we don't, and the enemy attacks us again, the American people have to be mentally prepared for the fact that we're in it for the long haul. And the long haul is not just the safety of this country, but as Charlie says, it's the liberties of this country as well.
Now, this question is for both of you. It concerns digital currency and privacy. I see a time in 10 years where paper currency is gone and 100% of our transactions are tracked by the NSA or IRS. Looking in terms of future technologies, what kind of parameters do we need to put around both security and liberty?
What a great question. And this kind of premise of the question has come from the rise of Bitcoin, which people may or may not be familiar with, which is kind of like an online cryptocurrency. The reason I love this question is in the next 2 years, we absolutely drastically need to overhaul the way that interdepartment collusion happens, and also the NSA, because we're only going to get more towards a technologically advanced society where it becomes easier and easier for unchecked bureaucracies to do what they do. So let's say that all of our currency is no longer paper and it's all online, and the IRS is dealing with the NSA and we haven't made any reforms. That's a pretty scary tag team for any kind of federal bureaucracy, if you ask me. So this is why this discussion needs to happen today, and the action needs to happen almost immediately. And the oversight and the results, and we the American people have to hold them accountable, the people in office, and especially because we can't unelect bureaucrats. That's something that that we never are able to do. We just can't say, oh, I don't want to have Lois Lerner be the head of the NSA. That's why we put people in Congress, and that's why Governor Gilmore holds people in Congress accountable to do that. And that's why you can either vote them in or out. And that's why it's so important that this is a top 5 issue heading in the next couple years.
Well, I'm for cash. I just don't have enough of it. None of us do. I think that we need to be thoughtful going forward about the rise of technology. Paper mail is now disappearing. We heard about all these wonderful letters this morning between the founding fathers, and letters just aren't written that much anymore. The world is changing. The technological capacity that we have created through the internet is changing the American society and the world society. It's making things very different. So I think we have to be very thoughtful about this going forward and make sure that whatever technological changes that we make, we never lose sight of that touchstones that Lynn Cheney was talking about this morning.
Thank you, Governor. This question says, if we start getting suicide bombers here, I believe people will drastically overreact and will make this a police state. How do we prevent that?
Yeah, you can kind of see the foreshadowing of what the police state could do. In Ferguson, agree or disagree with what's happened. For a local police to have that kind of authoritative force, you can kind of say, hold on a second, that's quite overwhelming. And I agree that we as Americans, as far as in the last 20 years, we have a tendency, like in 9/11, as the governor said, something happens, we completely overreact, right? We have a financial crisis 2008, let's spend $1 trillion we don't have. It's just whatever in our tendency as Americans in the regular political discourse to do that. So, and I will say this, that the greatest asset that we have as Americans, and I'll disagree with the governor on this, is not our intelligence, but it's the patriotism and loyalty of the American people. And if we lose that because the government creates paranoia and distrust in the American people, that can never be undone by some sort of supercomputer. The patriotism that lies in every single person in this room and every American, that is our greatest national asset. And that is what we must protect. And for lack of a better term, that's really what the Constitution was meant to do, to prevent government to come after us so that we, the people, could defend ourselves and that we, the people, could thrive. So our greatest national asset is not the NSA. It's not a supercomputer. It lies within ourselves as the people. So.
And I absolutely agree with Charlie on that. That's why Americans are exceptional, and that's one of our basic principles going forward of our future for this country and the future for our national security policy and our foreign policy. Americans are exceptional. We have touchstones that other people around the world don't have. I've lived in foreign countries. I've traveled to dozens of foreign countries, and each of those countries has their assets as well. But the American unique experience that Charlie refers to is exactly correct, and I think that we need to maintain those touchstones. Now, I do want to say once again, though, because I think I want to underscore it, I do worry about the rise of technology, and if we lose this confidence in ourselves and our ability to govern ourselves, there is danger. And I think the enemies of this country would like to do that. I think they would like to drive us to that point where a triggering attack of some kind would cause us to overreact, to do the wrong thing, which is why another principle I think that we have to have, a principle of homeland security, is we have to have more of a conversation with the American people, more of a sense of how they're cut into this challenge that we face. Have an understanding with the American people of the challenges that are indeed ahead of us in this long war that we're facing, and to go back to those touchstones that Charlie refers to, and to make sure that those things are solid in the American people so that when the inevitable attack comes, we don't overreact and call on our government to do things that are improper, and remember those touchstones of that American exceptionalism.
Well, I was unable to get to the entire stack of questions, so I'll be handing this to the NSA agent outside those doors. He'll be getting back with you. I want to give a chance for these two gentlemen to give 2-minute closing remarks, but I also would suggest that you talk to them after this panel and also visit TurningPointUSA and the Free Congress Foundation, as you will find a wealth of information at both places. And since the governor started, I will allow Charlie to do his statement first.
Great. Thank you. And I know that we talked about, the NSA's warrantless and unconstitutional behavior. A great solution for that is if we all emailed the Constitution to each other, they would read it finally and maybe understand it. This has been a great discussion and dialogue, and I hope everyone here was able to learn something and take something away from this panel. I will say this, that right now, I do not trust the government. I started my opening remarks with a question. Do you trust the government? I want everyone here to really ask themselves that, and I can venture a guess what your answer is. But ask yourselves, should we have unchecked federal bureaucracies, and what are you going to do to hold the Congress people accountable? The Constitution was written for a reason, and it was a timeless document. Everyone here, I'm sure, is very well versed in why it was written. But it was really written to limit government's authority against the people. And it was written to allow free people to prosper. And the thought process behind the Constitution, unlike any other document in human history, unlike the French and unlike the German, is our rights come from God. And those rights, as we all know, are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And part of our rights are also the ability to live our life without Big Brother looking over our shoulder, or the threat of retribution from a rogue IRS or NSA agent. And I think that this discussion, to be fruitful in the future, is to be able to understand that if we allow government to continue to go unchecked, then the abuse of power will continue. And the greatest national asset, no matter what the issue, it's not the NSA, it's not a supercomputer, it lies in you and the American people. And only the Constitution can allow the American people to continue to be free. Thank you.
We need to recognize the challenges ahead and to understand that we need to have a policy that means that the 21st century will also be an American century. And that means that we need a president who understands the exceptionalism of this country, understands the role of the United States in the world, particularly in this tumultuous and changing time, with rising new technology, with rising new opponents that we have to face, with the opportunities that we have to provide the stability in this country, which means we have to have an active foreign policy, not a reckless one, but an active foreign policy. We don't need to be lured into conflicts to dissipate our power, but nor should we be withdrawing and opening up the chances that we see right now for so many dangers to the world and to this country that we can adjust to and that we can, with American leadership, can change. We need a president that understands the nature of American power, the nature of American freedom, and the opportunities that we have to do the right thing. So in the end, we have to recognize that it's not a matter just of whether we trust the government. We can change the government. We can change the government. Americans are in a position to do that. At the end of the day, we have to make sure that in this conflict, this long conflict that we're in now and that we're in ahead, that we maintain our belief and our confidence in ourselves.
Thank you, Governor. You could please put your hands together and give a final applause to these two wonderful debaters.
Thank you. Well done.
Thank you. Great job.
Well done, Charles.
Thank you.